The moment the engine exploded at 30,000 feet, Lena Carter realized she was going to die next to the man she hated most in the world. That's where everything changed. What started as resentment in a corporate tower became something else entirely, when survival stripped away every mask, every lie, every carefully built wall between two people who thought they knew exactly who they were. This is their story, a fall from the sky that became a journey to something neither of them saw coming. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels, and if it moves you, hit that like button. Now, let's begin. The leather seat felt too soft. That was Lena Carter's first conscious thought as she settled into the private jet's cabin, her laptop bag clutched against her chest like a shield. Everything about this aircraft screamed excess: cream-colored leather, polished wood paneling, ambient lighting that probably cost more than her annual salary. She'd been designing marketing materials for Voss Industries for 3 years, and this was the first time she'd been summoned to travel with him. Adrian Voss sat across the aisle, his attention fixed on a tablet, fingers moving with mechanical precision. He hadn't acknowledged her presence since she'd boarded 15 minutes ago. Not a glance, not a word, just that infuriating focus that made everyone around him feel like furniture. Lena studied him from behind the safety of her laptop screen. Everything about Adrian Voss was sharp. The cut of his charcoal suit, the angle of his jaw, the cold calculation in those steel-gray eyes whenever they happened to land on anyone unlucky enough to require his attention. At 34, he'd built an empire by being ruthless, and he wore that reputation like armor. She hated him, not the passionate kind of hatred that burns hot and consumes you. No, this was the quiet, exhausting kind. The hatred born from 3 years of watching him crush people's ideas without explanation, cancel projects with a single word, and treat human beings like data points in whatever algorithm ran inside his head. The flight attendant appeared, offering drinks with a practiced smile. "Ms. Carter? Mr. Voss?" "Water," Lena said quietly. Adrian didn't look up. "Nothing." The attendant retreated and silence reclaimed the cabin. Outside the windows, Seattle had become a memory beneath clouds that looked like cotton pulled apart. They were heading to Vancouver for a merger meeting, 45 minutes in the air, Adrian had said during the 5-second briefing he'd given her in the hallway that morning. "Bring the Peterson campaign mock-ups. Be ready to present. Don't waste time." Those were the only words he'd spoken directly to her in 6 months. Lena's fingers hovered over her keyboard, but she couldn't focus. Something felt wrong. She'd noticed it during boarding, the flight crew exchanging glances, the pilot's voice just a fraction too tight during the safety announcement. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe it was just nerves. She'd never been comfortable with flying, and doing it in close quarters with Adrian Voss made every instinct scream to run. "You're wasting energy worrying about turbulence." Lena's head snapped up. Adrian was looking at her now, those gray eyes sharp enough to cut. I'm not... Your leg's been bouncing for 10 minutes. Either you're anxious about the flight or you drank too much coffee. He turned his attention back to his tablet. "Turbulence is statistically insignificant. Focus on your work." Heat flooded her cheeks. "I am focused." "Then stop fidgeting." The words landed like a slap. Lena's jaw tightened, her fingers curling against the laptop's edge. This was Adrian Voss in his natural habitat, reducing people to their inefficiencies, cataloging their weaknesses, filing them away in whatever cold storage he used instead of a heart. She forced her attention back to the screen, pulling up the Peterson campaign files. Colors and layouts blurred together as frustration buzzed beneath her skin. 3 years. 3 years of her best work being dissected by this man who probably didn't know the names of half the people who worked for him. The jet lurched. Lena's stomach dropped as the aircraft shuddered, a violent motion that sent her laptop sliding toward the floor. She grabbed for it instinctively, her seatbelt cutting across her chest. Across the aisle, Adrian's tablet went dark as his hand shot out to brace against the seat in front of him. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor mechanical difficulties." The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, professionally calm but missing its earlier warmth. "Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened. We'll have this sorted shortly." Minor. The word did nothing to stop the ice spreading through Lena's veins as the jet shook again, harder this time. Through the window, she could see the wing and something that definitely wasn't right. A thin trail of dark smoke curled from the engine housing, barely visible against the clouds. Adrian. His name left her lips before she could stop it. The engine! He was already moving, unbuckling his seatbelt despite the pilot's instructions, crossing to her side of the cabin in 3 strides. He leaned over her seat to look through her window, his body creating a wall of expensive cologne and barely controlled tension. The smoke was thicker now. Seatbelt. Now. Adrian's voice had lost its usual flatness, replaced by something almost human, command mixed with something that might have been fear. He grabbed his own seatbelt, yanking it tight across his chest. The intercom crackled again. We're making an emergency descent. Brace positions. I repeat, brace positions. Lena's hands were shaking as she pulled her laptop against her stomach, tucking her head down the way they showed in safety videos no one ever really watched. Her breath came in shallow gasps. This wasn't happening. This was supposed to be 45 minutes, a simple flight. Nothing that could... The explosion came without warning. Not a sound. An experience. A physical force that tore through reality itself, transforming the ordered world of the cabin into chaos. The jet's frame screamed, metal shrieking against metal as something fundamental broke. Lena felt herself lifted against her seatbelt, her body weightless for an impossible moment as the aircraft tilted violently. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, swinging wildly. Emergency lights flashed red, painting everything in hellish strobes. The roar of wind filled her ears as somewhere, everywhere, air rushed past torn metal. She couldn't see through the windows anymore, just spinning clouds and flashes of green that might have been ground. Her laptop was gone. The cabin was sideways. No, they were sideways or upside down or falling. All of it at once. The seatbelt cut into her chest like a blade, holding her as the world spun, and reality became a nightmare of noise and motion and terror, so pure it erased thought itself. Through it all, one image burned into her consciousness. Adrian Voss's face. He was looking at her, not at his tablet, not at the chaos consuming them, but directly at her. Across the impossible distance of the tilting cabin, his gray eyes locked on hers. In that moment, stripped of everything, he wasn't her boss. Wasn't cold, untouchable Adrian Voss who treated people like equations. He was just a man. Terrified. Human. Their eyes held for 3 seconds that contained entire lifetimes. She saw fear there. Real, raw fear that mirrored her own. She saw recognition, the acknowledgement that this was the end, that in seconds they would cease to exist, that everything they'd ever been or done or felt would stop. And she saw something else. Something that made no sense in that moment of ultimate chaos. Regret. Then the aircraft tore apart, the world became violence. Metal screamed and split. Wind became a physical thing, tearing at everything. Lena's body jerked against the seatbelt as the cabin section ripped away from something. The cockpit maybe, or the tail, impossible to tell. And suddenly there was sky, where a wall had been, and the roar of wind was all there was. She was falling. They were all falling. The forest rose up to meet them like a living thing, green and endless and absolutely final. Lena's scream tore from her throat, lost instantly in the impossible noise of descent. She saw trees, saw the ground racing closer, saw pieces of the aircraft scattered across the sky like twisted confetti. She saw Adrian's section of the cabin spinning away, separating from hers in the chaos. Then the trees reached up and swallowed everything. Impact. Not one moment, but 1,000, compressed into an eternal second. Branches breaking, metal crumpling, her body thrown against restraints that held and didn't hold simultaneously. Sound became pain, became darkness, became nothing, became silence. The quiet was what woke her. Not gentle silence, not peaceful, the silence of a world holding its breath, waiting to see if she would take another one herself. Lena's eyes opened to green, leaves, branches, sky visible in patches through a canopy that swayed gently overhead. For several seconds, she couldn't understand what she was seeing. Her brain struggled to connect the peaceful forest scene above her with the last memory she had. Falling, the aircraft coming apart, that moment when she'd known with absolute certainty that she was going to die. But she was breathing. Her chest rose and fell, each breath a small miracle that hurt in ways she couldn't quite catalog yet. Her body was a map of pain, but the fact that she could feel it meant something impossible. She was alive. Oh God. The words came out as barely a whisper, her throat raw. "Oh God! Oh God!" Lena tried to move and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through her left side, sharp enough to gray her vision for a moment. She was lying on her back in undergrowth, leaves and broken branches surrounding her like a nest. How was that possible? She should be dead. The fall alone should have... The seatbelt. She looked down, confused, and found herself still strapped into her seat. Not the whole cabin, just her seat, torn free from the aircraft's frame, the metal twisted and scorched, but somehow intact enough to have... What? Caught in the trees? Absorbed some of the impact? She didn't understand. Couldn't understand. But she was here, alive, lying in a forest that stretched endlessly in every direction. With shaking hands, Lena fumbled for the seatbelt release. It took 3 tries, her fingers clumsy with shock and pain, but finally the mechanism clicked and she was free. She rolled onto her side slowly, testing each movement for new pain. Her left arm throbbed, her ribs screamed, but everything moved. Nothing felt broken, though she had no idea how that was possible. Standing took effort. The world tilted dangerously when she first tried, and she had to grab onto a tree trunk to keep from falling. Her legs shook, threatening to fold, but she forced them to hold. One breath. Another. The forest spun slightly, then steadied. Debris was everywhere. Now that she was upright, Lena could see it. Pieces of the aircraft scattered through the trees like twisted artwork. A section of wing hung in branches 20 feet above her. Metal fragments dotted the forest floor, some still smoking. Insulation and wiring and things she couldn't identify were strewn across the undergrowth, incongruous and horrible against the natural beauty of the forest. "Hello?" Her voice came out weak, barely carrying 10 feet. Lena cleared her throat and tried again, louder. "Hello, is anyone there?" Silence answered. Just wind through leaves and the distant call of a bird that had no idea the world had just ended. The pilot. The flight attendant. They had been in the cockpit, in the front section that had separated during the descent. Lena's stomach turned as she realized what that meant. If she'd been thrown clear with just her seat, if the cabin had torn apart the way she remembered. She pushed the thought away. Couldn't think about that now. Had to focus on immediate things. Had to... Adrian. The memory hit her like a physical blow. His face in that last moment, his eyes locked on hers. The terror and humanity she'd seen there. His section of the cabin had been spinning away from hers when everything went dark. He'd been falling too. Was he... Adrian! The name tore from her throat, louder than she'd known she could manage. Adrian Voss! She waited, her heart hammering. Nothing. Just the forest's indifferent quiet and the sound of her own ragged breathing. Lena started walking, each step sending fresh pain through her battered body. She had no idea which direction to go. The debris field stretched in multiple directions, pieces of the aircraft creating a trail through the trees. She followed it instinctively, calling out every few steps. "Adrian, can anyone hear me?" The forest swallowed her words. Massive trees rose around her, Douglas firs, she thought, or maybe cedars. She'd grown up in Oregon, had hiked enough to recognize old-growth forest when she saw it. This was untouched wilderness, the kind of place that didn't see human activity often. No trails visible. No sounds of civilization, just endless green and the whisper of wind through branches. How far had they fallen? Where were they? More debris appeared, a door torn off its hinges. Seats scattered like toys. A section of fuselage crumpled against a tree trunk, the Voss Industries logo still visible through the scorch marks. Each piece was a reminder of the violence that had happened here, the impossible survival she'd somehow managed. That they'd both managed? Adrian! What? She was moving faster now, ignoring the protests from her body. Please, if you can hear me! She saw it before she registered what she was seeing. Another seat, torn free like hers. Strapped to it, slumped forward against the restraints, was a figure in a charcoal suit. Lena's breath caught. She stumbled forward, nearly falling, catching herself against a tree as her legs threatened to give out. 20 feet. 15. 10. She could see him now, really see him. Adrian Voss hung in the seatbelt, his head down, body motionless. Blood matted his dark hair on the left side. His suit was torn in places, the expensive fabric shredded, but his chest was moving. Adrian, Lena reached him, her hand shaking as she touched his shoulder. He was solid and warm and alive. Adrian, can you hear me? No response. His eyes were closed, face slack with unconsciousness. Lena fumbled for the pulse point at his neck, her fingers clumsy with urgency. For several terrible seconds she couldn't find it, and her mind started spiraling toward panic. There. Faint but steady, his pulse beat beneath her fingers. He was alive. They were both alive. The impossibility of it hit her all at once, and Lena found herself laughing, a slightly hysterical sound that echoed through the empty forest. They'd survived. Somehow. Impossibly. They'd both survived a plane crash that should have killed them instantly. But surviving the crash was one thing. Surviving what came after. Lena looked around, really taking in their situation for the first time. Forest stretched in every direction, dense and unbroken. No roads visible, no signs of civilization. She could see mountains in the distance through gaps in the canopy, their peaks sharp against the sky. They could be anywhere. Somewhere between Seattle and Vancouver meant thousands of square miles of wilderness. The sun was past its peak, angling toward afternoon. How long had she been unconscious? An hour? More? They had maybe 5 or 6 hours of daylight left, and then it would be night in the wilderness with an unconscious man and no supplies. Okay, Lena spoke aloud, trying to anchor herself with the sound of her own voice. Okay, first things first. Get him out of the seat. The seatbelt release was jammed. She pulled at it, her fingers finding no give in the mechanism. The metal was bent slightly, probably from impact. Lena looked around desperately for something to use as leverage and found a piece of metal strut a few feet away. It took 3 tries and all her strength, but finally the release gave with a groan. Adrian sagged forward, and Lena barely caught him before he hit the ground. He was heavy, dead weight, muscles completely slack, and she ended up half lowering, half dropping him onto the forest floor. He didn't wake, didn't even stir. "Come on," she muttered, checking his pulse again, still steady. That was good. The head wound looked bad but wasn't bleeding actively anymore. Also good. But unconsciousness meant possible concussion, possible internal injuries, possible stop. She couldn't think like that. Had to focus on what she could do, not what might be wrong. Water. That was the first priority. In survival situations, and she'd read enough, done enough casual hiking to know the basics. Water came before food, before shelter if the weather was moderate. And she had no idea when Adrian would wake up, if he'd be able to move when he did. Lena stood slowly, her body protesting every movement. Her left arm was definitely injured. Not broken, she didn't think, but badly bruised. Her ribs ached with each breath. But she could move. She could function. The problem was finding water in a forest without knowing where she was or which direction to go. She closed her eyes, listening. Her father had taught her this once, during a camping trip when she was 12. Listen to the land, he'd said. It'll tell you what you need to know. At first there was nothing but wind and birds. Then, faint beneath those sounds, something else. The whisper of movement, liquid over stone. Running water, maybe a quarter-mile away based on the sound. East. The water was east. Lena looked down at Adrian's unconscious form. She couldn't leave him, shouldn't leave him. But she also couldn't carry him, and they needed water. Needed a better place to shelter than here in the open forest floor. "I'll be back," she told him, even though he couldn't hear. 20 minutes. I promise. She marked the spot in her mind, the distinctive shape of a dead tree nearby, the angle of fallen debris. Then she started walking, following the sound of water, praying she wasn't making a terrible mistake. The stream was beautiful. That was Lena's first thought when she pushed through a final screen of undergrowth and found it. A clear flow of water tumbling over moss-covered rocks, maybe 10 feet wide at its widest point. It moved with the kind of energy that said snowmelt from mountains, cold and clean and perfect. Relief hit her so hard she nearly cried. She knelt at the stream's edge, cupping water in her hands and drinking deeply. It was ice cold, tasting of minerals and stone and life. She drank until her stomach hurt, then sat back on her heels, breathing hard. Okay. Water source secured. Now she needed to find a way to carry it back to Adrian and find shelter. And movement caught her eye upstream. Lena froze, her heart suddenly hammering. There, on the opposite bank, maybe 30 yards away, a massive shape moved through the shadows. Dark fur, powerful shoulders, the shambling gait of something that had never learned to fear humans because it had never needed to. A bear. It hadn't seen her, was focused on something else, nosing at the ground near the water's edge. Lena remained perfectly still, every muscle locked, barely breathing. She'd read about bear encounters. Knew you weren't supposed to run, weren't supposed to make sudden movements. But reading about it and actually being there, watching several 100 pounds of predator move through the same space she occupied, was entirely different. The bear lifted its head, sniffing the air. "Don't see me," Lena thought desperately. "Please don't see me." For several eternal seconds, the bear stood motionless, its head turned slightly in her direction. Then, with an almost casual movement, it turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing into the undergrowth like a shadow. Lena remained frozen for a full minute after it vanished, her heart trying to break through her chest. Only when she was absolutely certain it was gone did she allow herself to move, backing away from the stream slowly before turning and half running back the way she'd come. Adrian was exactly where she'd left him, still unconscious in the growing afternoon shadows. Lena dropped to her knees beside him, checking his pulse again, still steady, before sitting back and trying to calm her racing thoughts. They had water nearby. That was good. They also had bears nearby. That was very, very bad. She looked at the debris scattered around them. Could she use any of it for shelter? The section of fuselage she'd passed might work. If she could drag Adrian to it. If she could create some kind of barrier, if she could find a way to make them invisible to predators while Adrian was helpless. And she was one person. Injured. Exhausted. Terrified. "Please wake up," she whispered, looking at Adrian's slack face. "I really, really need you to wake up." But he didn't. Just kept breathing, kept existing in that space between consciousness and its absence, leaving Lena alone with the forest and the approaching night and the impossible task of keeping them both alive. She forced herself to stand. Sitting here wouldn't help. Had to keep moving, had to find shelter before dark, had to... Adrian groaned. The sound was soft, barely audible, but Lena spun toward him so fast she nearly fell. His eyelids fluttered. His hand twitched against the ground. Then slowly, impossibly, his eyes opened. Gray. Still sharp despite the confusion clouding them. "What?" His voice came out rough, barely more than a whisper. "What happened?" Lena felt something break loose in her chest, relief so intense it was almost painful. "The plane crashed. We're..." She looked around at the endless forest. "I don't know where we are. Somewhere in the wilderness." Adrian blinked slowly, his gaze sharpening as consciousness returned. He tried to sit up, made it about 6 inches before his face went gray and he sagged back with a curse. "Don't move," Lena said quickly, kneeling beside him. "You hit your head. You could have a concussion." "Could have..." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not cold calculation, not dismissal, something raw and human. "You're injured. So are you." "The pilot?" Lena shook her head. She didn't have to say it. Adrian's jaw tightened, and for a moment something that might have been grief flickered across his face before he locked it down. When he spoke again, his voice had regained some of its usual control, though it remained rough around the edges. "How long was I out?" "I don't know, maybe an hour. I was unconscious too." He processed this, his gaze moving past her to take in their surroundings. She watched his face as he cataloged the situation, the debris, the forest, the lowering sun, watched him reach the same conclusion she had. They were alone, miles from anywhere, with night coming. "Can you stand?" she asked. "Yes." But when he tried, his legs refused to cooperate. He made it to his knees before the world clearly tilted, and Lena had to grab his arm to keep him from toppling over. "Take it slow," she said. I need to stand." There was steel in his voice now, the command she recognized from boardrooms. But it was different here, not directed at her as an employee, but spoken as simple fact. He did need to stand. Because if he couldn't, if he remained helpless on the forest floor, neither of them would say it, but they both knew. Out here, helplessness meant death. It took 3 tries and Lena's support, but finally Adrian got his feet under him. He swayed, his hand gripping her shoulder hard enough to hurt, but he stayed upright. His face had gone pale, emphasizing the blood matted in his hair, but his eyes remained clear. "There's water," Lena said, "about a quarter mile that way. And I found a section of the fuselage that might work for shelter." Adrian looked at her for a long moment, and in that gaze Lena saw something shift. A recognition, an acknowledgement that out here, the titles and roles they'd worn in the office meant nothing. Out here, they were just two people trying not to die. "Show me," he said. They moved slowly through the forest, Adrian leaning on her more than Lena suspected he wanted to admit. Each step was an exercise in determination, his breathing harsh but steady. She guided him to the fuselage section she'd spotted earlier, a curved piece of cabin wall about 8 feet long, one side relatively intact, offering at least some protection from the elements. "It's not much," Lena said as they reached it. "It's something." Adrian eased himself down beside it, his back against the metal. Sweat beaded his forehead despite the cooling air. "The water?" "That way. There's a stream." She hesitated, then added, "I saw a bear." His eyes snapped to her face. "How close?" "Close enough." He nodded slowly, taking this in. "Then we need fire. Before dark." "I don't know how to start a fire without matches." "I do." He looked at her, and something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You're not the only one who grew up outside cities, Ms. Carter." It was strange hearing her name in his voice out here, in this place so removed from boardrooms and office hierarchies. Strange and somehow grounding. "What do you need?" she asked. "Dry wood. Lots of it. The driest you can find. Look under logs, in protected areas. And..." He scanned the ground around them, then pointed to a relatively flat piece of metal from the aircraft. "That. And cloth. Anything that survived from the cabin." Lena spent the next hour gathering supplies while Adrian worked with methodical focus, despite his obvious pain. She watched him from the corner of her eye as she collected wood, watched him strip wires from debris and create what looked like a bow drill apparatus using the metal sheet, a stick, and thread pulled from the aircraft seats. This wasn't the man she knew. That Adrian Voss would have been helpless out here, would have expected someone else to handle the physical work while he made executive decisions. But this version moved with quiet competence, his hands sure despite the tremor she sometimes caught. Who was he really? Who had he been before he became the untouchable CEO everyone feared? The sun was touching the mountain peaks when Adrian finally coaxed smoke from his apparatus. Lena held her breath as he carefully added tinder she'd gathered, dry moss and shredded cloth, and breathed life into the ember he'd created. The smoke thickened, then suddenly burst into flame. They had fire. Relief and exhaustion hit Lena simultaneously. She sank down on the opposite side of the flames from Adrian, watching sparks rise into the darkening sky. Her body ached everywhere. Her mind felt foggy with shock and adrenaline crash. But they had water nearby, had shelter of a sort, had fire to keep away predators and provide warmth. They were alive. "We survived," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Across the flames, Adrian looked at her with those sharp gray eyes. In the firelight, they seemed less cold somehow, more human. "Yes," he said. "Now we have to stay that way." The forest grew dark around their small circle of light. Somewhere in the distance, something howled, wolf or coyote, Lena couldn't tell. Closer, the stream sang its endless song over stone. Above them, through gaps in the canopy, stars began to emerge. Lena pulled her knees to her chest, wincing at the pain in her ribs. Tomorrow they would need to make real decisions about water purification, about food, about whether to stay here or try to move, about how to signal for rescue. Tomorrow they would need to face the full reality of their situation. But tonight, in this moment, they had fire. They had shelter. They had survived. It was enough. Adrian fed another stick to the flames, his movements careful and precise. "You did well today," he said, not looking at her. "With the water, the shelter location, most people would have panicked." Lena blinked, startled by what might have been the first genuine compliment she'd ever heard from him. "I grew up hiking. My dad taught me basic wilderness skills." "Then he taught you well." Silence fell between them, but it felt different from the cold silences in the office. Less hostile. More, Companionable wasn't the right word, but something closer to shared experience than mutual toleration. What about you? Lena found herself asking. How do you know how to make fire with a bow drill? Adrian was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, my uncle. He believed in teaching practical skills, said knowing how to survive made you stronger at everything else. There was something in his voice, not quite bitterness, not quite nostalgia, something complicated that Lena couldn't parse. She waited, but he didn't elaborate, just continued feeding the fire with methodical care. The howling came again, closer this time. Adrian's hand moved to a piece of metal strut he'd positioned nearby. Not quite a weapon, but something that could serve as one if needed. Lena noticed the movement, noticed how he'd positioned himself between her and the darkest part of the forest. You should sleep, he said. I'll keep watch. You're concussed. You need rest more than I do. I'm also trained to function without sleep. He finally looked at her, firelight carving shadows across his face. And you're the one who spent the afternoon gathering supplies while I sat here being useless. Sleep, Ms. Carter. That's not a request. There it was, the command tone. But somehow, out here with darkness pressing in around them and danger in every shadow, it didn't feel like office tyranny. It felt like someone trying to keep them both alive. Lena settled against the fuselage section, pulling her torn jacket tighter around herself. The metal was hard and uncomfortable, but exhaustion was already pulling at her consciousness. Her eyes drifted shut, then opened again. Adrian? Yes? We're going to be okay, right? The vulnerability in her voice surprised her. But something about the darkness and the fire and the impossible fact of their survival stripped away the need for pretense. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I don't know. It should have been terrifying, that honest uncertainty. But somehow, coming from him, it was almost comforting. No false promises, no corporate optimism, just truth. But, Adrian continued, his voice carrying across the fire, we survived a plane crash. That gives us better odds than we had 6 hours ago. Lena found herself almost smiling. It was true. 6 hours ago, they'd been falling from the sky, certain of death. Now they had fire and shelter and each other, even if that each other consisted of two people who'd barely spoken 50 words in 3 years. She closed her eyes, letting exhaustion claim her. Her last conscious thought was of that moment in the falling aircraft. Adrian's eyes locked on hers, seeing her not as an employee, but as another human being facing the same terror, the same end. In the darkness, she heard him add wood to the fire, heard the crackle of flames, heard the endless whisper of the wilderness around them. And for the first time in 3 years, Lena Carter and Adrian Voss existed in the same space as equals. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new impossibilities to navigate. But tonight, against all odds, they were alive. And that was everything. Dawn came slowly to the forest, gray light filtering through the canopy in stages, transforming shadows into shapes into the reality of their situation. Lena woke to the smell of smoke and the ache of every muscle in her body. For one merciful moment, her mind was blank. Then memory crashed back like a second impact. The crash, the forest, Adrian. She sat up too quickly, her ribs screaming protest. Across the dead fire, Adrian was gone. Panic seized her throat. Adrian? Here. His voice came from behind the fuselage section, rough with exhaustion, but steady. Relief flooded through her so intensely it left her lightheaded. He appeared a moment later, his suit jacket discarded, white shirt torn and stained with blood and dirt. The wound on his head had crusted over, dark against his pale skin. He looked like he hadn't slept at all, which Lena realized he probably hadn't. You should have woken me to take a turn on watch, she said. You needed the sleep more. He moved carefully, she noticed, favoring his left side. I found something. He held up a twisted piece of metal, part of the aircraft's emergency kit. The container was crushed, but inside, visible through a crack in the casing, were supplies. Reflective blankets, a first aid kit, water purification tablets. That's... Lena stood, ignoring her body's protests. That's incredible. How did you find it? Couldn't sleep. Searched the debris field. He set the kit down and began working it open with a piece of sharp metal. We'll need to inventory everything. Figure out what we have. The emergency kit yielded treasures beyond measure: a small knife, waterproof matches, the purification tablets, 2 emergency blankets, basic first aid supplies including antiseptic and bandages, a signal mirror, and a compass. Not enough to guarantee survival, but enough to shift their odds dramatically. The compass, Adrian said, turning it over in his hands. The glass face was cracked, but the needle still moved, swinging north with magnetic certainty. If we can figure out where we are. Vancouver was northeast of Seattle, Lena said, the geography coming back from years of living in the Pacific Northwest. We were heading that direction when… She didn't finish, didn't need to. Adrian studied the compass, his expression thoughtful. The mountains we can see from here, I think they're the Cascades, which means we're probably somewhere in the North Cascades range. Wilderness area, thousands of square miles of it. The enormity of that sank in slowly. Thousands of square miles. No roads, no towns, just endless forest and mountains, and the very real possibility that no one would find them before. Before what? Before they ran out of food? Before injury or illness took them? Before winter came and the forest became truly impassable? We need water first, Adrian said, cutting through her spiraling thoughts with that same decisive tone he used in boardrooms. But out here, it didn't sound like control. It sounded like focus. Then we need to address these injuries properly. Then we plan. They made their way to the stream together, moving slowly through morning mist that clung to the forest floor like something alive. Adrian's steps were more assured than yesterday, but Lena could see the effort it cost him, the way his jaw tightened with each movement, the careful way he held his left side. "You're hurt worse than you're saying," she observed. "Cracked rib. Maybe 2. He said it matter-of-factly, as if describing a scheduling conflict. Nothing we can do about it except wrap it tight and avoid unnecessary movement. Unnecessary movement like walking a quarter mile to a stream? That's necessary movement. The ghost of something that might have been humor touched his voice. You should see the unnecessary movements I'm avoiding. At the stream, they filled their empty water bottles, salvaged from the wreckage, and added purification tablets. The taste would be chemical and unpleasant, Adrian explained, but it was better than the alternative. While they waited for the tablets to work, Lena helped him clean and bandage the head wound properly. "This needs stitches," she said, examining the gash. It was about 2 inches long, the edges ragged. "I don't suppose you learned field medicine from your uncle, too?" "No, but I've read enough to fake it." He met her eyes, and something in his expression softened slightly. "We'll make do. We always do." We. The word hung between them, strange and new. There had never been a we before, just him giving orders and her following them. But out here, that distinction had dissolved like morning mist. They spent the morning doing inventory and making plans. The emergency supplies helped, but they were limited. No food except for energy bars in the kit, 6 of them, which meant 3 days if they split them. After that, "I can make snares," Adrian said, examining the wire from the aircraft. "Small game, rabbits, maybe squirrels if we're lucky." Lena stared at him. "You know how to trap animals?" My uncle believed in comprehensive education. There was something in his voice, not quite bitterness, not quite fondness, something complex that spoke of a past she'd never imagined him having. Tracking, trapping, field dressing. He said knowing how to provide for yourself was the foundation of true power. "Is that why you…" She hesitated, not sure if she should ask, but the forest had stripped away the usual boundaries. "Is that why you're so… controlled? All the time?" Adrian's hand stilled on the wire he was working with. For a moment, Lena thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Control is survival. In business. In life. Letting emotions dictate decisions gets people killed." He looked up at her, his gray eyes sharp. "Or it did where I grew up." She wanted to ask more, wanted to understand the transformation that had turned a boy who knew how to trap rabbits into a man who ruled boardrooms with calculated precision. But something in his expression warned her not to push. Not yet. "I'll gather more firewood," she said instead, "and see if I can find anything edible. Berries, maybe, or don't eat anything unless you're absolutely certain it's safe." The command was immediate and firm. "Some of the most poisonous plants out here look like food. If you're not sure, bring it back and we'll evaluate together." Together. There was that word again. The day passed in careful work. Adrian set snares at strategic points around the stream. Animals need water, they'll come, while Lena gathered firewood and searched for edible plants. She found wild strawberries, tiny but unmistakable, and brought them back triumphantly. Adrian examined them carefully before nodding approval. Good eye, these are safe. He popped one in his mouth, and something that might have been surprise crossed his face. Better than safe, actual food. They split the berries, rationing them carefully. It wasn't much, maybe a handful each, but it felt like victory. Proof that they could provide for themselves, that survival was possible. That evening, as they sat by a carefully managed fire, Lena found herself studying him in the flickering light. 3 years she'd worked for Adrian Voss, and she'd never really looked at him as a person. He'd been a force, a presence, a source of frustration and occasional fear. But now, watching him methodically feed the fire and check the snares he'd made, she saw someone different, someone capable, focused, and underneath the control, possibly afraid. Can I ask you something? She said. He glanced up. You're going to regardless. Fair point. Why did you build Voss Industries? What were you trying to prove? Adrian was quiet for so long she thought he'd refuse to answer. Then, I was trying to prove I didn't need anyone, that I could create something that couldn't be taken away. He poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling into darkness. My uncle taught me survival skills. My father taught me that everything you care about can disappear in an instant. The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. Years of something Lena couldn't quite name. Loss, maybe. Or loneliness wearing the mask of power. Is that why you keep everyone at distance? She asked quietly. Even in the office? Distance is safety. He looked at her directly, and in his eyes she saw something raw. You can't lose what you never let yourself need. The honesty of it struck her silent. This was the truth beneath all those cold interactions, all those dismissals and calculated cruelties. Not malice, but defense. A fortress built so carefully that even he might have forgotten what he was protecting. That sounds exhausting, Lena said finally. It is. The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. Then, softer. But it's kept me alive this long. Before Lena could respond, movement caught her eye. Something shifting in the darkness beyond their fire's circle of light. She tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the metal strut they kept as a weapon. Adrian saw it too. He was already moving, rising smoothly despite his injuries, positioning himself between her and the darkness. Don't move, he said quietly. Don't make eye contact. The bear emerged from shadows like a nightmare-given form. Massive, close, too close. Its dark eyes reflected firelight as it regarded them with what might have been curiosity or hunger or simple territorial assertion. Lena's heart hammered so hard she was certain the bear could hear it. Beside her, Adrian remained utterly still, his body coiled with tension but showing no fear, or at least showing no fear to the bear. When I say run, he whispered, barely audible, you run to that tree behind us. Climb. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you. That's not a discussion. His voice carried absolute command. On my mark. The bear huffed, a sound like a steam engine releasing pressure. Then, with shocking speed for something so large, it charged. Now! Adrian's shout cracked like a whip, but instead of running, instead of climbing, he did something Lena's mind could barely process. He grabbed a burning branch from the fire and lunged forward, meeting the bear's charge with fire and a roar that seemed torn from something primal. The bear pulled up short, confused by this human who didn't run, didn't cower. For one eternal second, Adrian and the bear faced each other, man and nature in the rawest possible confrontation. Then Adrian thrust the burning branch forward again, shouting wordlessly, and the bear made its decision. It turned and lumbered back into darkness, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. Adrian stood frozen for another moment, the burning branch held before him like a sword. Then his legs seemed to give out, and he collapsed to his knees, gasping. Are you insane? Lena was beside him instantly, her hands shaking as she checked him for injuries. You could have been killed. So could you. He was breathing hard, his face pale in the firelight. That's why I told you to climb. And you were just going to face down a bear alone? I was going to give you time to get to safety. He said it like it was obvious. Like risking his life for hers was a simple equation that balanced. Lena stared at him, something shifting fundamentally in her understanding. This man, this cold, untouchable CEO, who'd never shown her a moment of warmth in 3 years, had just put himself between her and a predator without hesitation. "You're still insane," she said, but her voice caught on the words. "Probably." Adrian looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled. Actually smiled, not the corporate mask he wore in meetings, but something genuine and slightly wild. "But we're alive." They were. Against impossible odds, against nature's fury and their own mortality, they were alive. That night, they took turns on watch, but Lena found herself unable to sleep during her rest period. She kept seeing Adrian's face in that moment of confrontation, the absolute determination, the absence of hesitation. He would have died to give her time to escape. Would have faced down the bear alone if it meant she survived. When had she stopped being just an employee to him? Or had she always been more, and he'd just been too controlled to show it? The question haunted her as she sat watch hours later, feeding the fire while Adrian slept. He looked younger in sleep, the hard edges of his face softened. More human. More like whatever he'd been before life taught him that control was survival. Dawn came eventually, as it always did. Adrian woke with the light, his movements stiff but determined. They checked the snares together. One had triggered, catching a rabbit that would mean real protein, real calories. Adrian field-dressed it with practiced efficiency while Lena tried not to watch too closely. "Your uncle taught you that too?" she asked. "Everything." He worked quickly, his hands sure despite the grisly nature of the task. He said civilization was a thin veneer, that underneath we were all still animals, and the ones who remembered that survived when the veneer cracked. He sounds intense. He was preparing me. Adrian paused, then continued more quietly. My father was unstable, made enemies, lost everything twice before I was 10. My uncle wanted me ready for when it happened again. Did it? Yes. Single word carrying years of weight. But by then I'd learned to build things that couldn't be taken, things that existed in contracts and corporations, not trust or family. The pieces were falling into place, the obsessive control, the emotional distance, the way he treated every interaction like a potential battlefield. He'd been taught that everything could be lost, so he'd made himself into someone who lost nothing by never truly having anything. It was brilliant and tragic in equal measure. They cooked the rabbit over the fire, and the smell was almost overwhelming after 2 days of energy bars and wild berries. Adrian portioned it carefully, making sure she got slightly more despite her protests. You weigh less, he said pragmatically. You'll feel calorie deficit faster. Eat. She ate, and it was the best meal she could remember having. Strange how desperation transformed simple things into treasures. We need to make a decision, Adrian said as they finished eating. Stay here and wait for rescue, or try to move. What do you think? He considered, his expression thoughtful. The crash site is our best chance for searchers to find us, but we don't know if anyone's looking or where they're looking if they are. The flight plan had us over remote wilderness. We could be miles from where they expect. So we stay. For now. But we make preparations, build better shelter, stockpile food and firewood, create signals, smoke during day, fire at night. Use the mirror when we hear aircraft. He looked at her seriously. And we prepare for the possibility that rescue doesn't come before winter. The thought was terrifying. They were in late summer now, maybe 6 weeks before the first snows in these mountains. 6 weeks to either be found or become self-sufficient enough to survive what came next. Then we'd better get started, Lena said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. They worked through the day with focused intensity. Adrian used debris from the aircraft to reinforce their shelter, creating walls that would hold heat and block wind. Lena gathered moss for insulation and cut evergreen boughs for bedding, softer than the ground, and the needles would help repel insects. It was exhausting work, made harder by their injuries. Lena's ribs ached with every movement. Adrian's cracked ribs had him breathing carefully, working in measured bursts. But they pushed through, driven by the understanding that every improvement to their situation was another step toward survival. You're different out here, Lena observed during a water break. From the office. So are you. Adrian wiped sweat from his forehead, wincing as the motion pulled at his injuries. In meetings, you were always so quiet, deferential. Out here, you're decisive, strong. In meetings, you terrified me. I know. He said it without pride or shame, just acknowledgement. That was intentional. Fear keeps people focused, keeps them from making mistakes that cost time and money. Does it work? In business? Yes. He looked at her steadily. Out here? Fear just gets you killed. By evening, their shelter had transformed from a piece of wreckage into something approaching livable. Not comfortable, but protected. Defensible. Adrian had even rigged a simple alarm system using wire and tin from the aircraft. Anything trying to approach would make noise. They sat by the fire that night, exhausted but satisfied with the day's work. The rabbit had lasted through lunch as well, and they still had 3 energy bars left. The snares were reset. They had water, shelter, fire. The basics were covered. Tell me about your family, Adrian said suddenly. Your father who taught you to hike. Lena was surprised by the question. Adrian Voss didn't do personal, didn't ask about lives outside work. But maybe Adrian Voss, the CEO, and Adrian Voss, the survivor, were different people. Dad was a park ranger, she said. Oregon coast. He believed nature was the best teacher, said if you paid attention, the forest would tell you everything you needed to know. She smiled at the memory. He died when I was 19, heart attack on a trail he'd hiked 1,000 times. I'm sorry. Me too. Boo, she poked at the fire. After that, I threw myself into design school. Easier to focus on creating beauty than dealing with the loss, you know? I do know. Adrian's voice was quiet. When my father died, I was 22. I spent the next 12 years building Voss Industries. Never stopped long enough to process it. Did that work? No. The honesty in his voice was raw. But it gave me something to control when everything else was chaos. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching sparks rise toward stars. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called. Closer, the stream sang its endless song. Adrian? Lena hesitated, then pushed forward. Why did you put yourself between me and the bear? He was quiet for a long moment. Because losing you would have meant being alone out here. That's not the whole reason. No. He looked at her across the fire, and in his eyes she saw something she couldn't quite name, but it's the one I can admit to right now. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Lena felt her pulse quicken, felt something shift in the air between them, awareness of each other not as colleagues or even as partners in survival, but as man and woman, drawn together by circumstance and something deeper. We should sleep, Adrian said, breaking the moment. Tomorrow we need to improve the signal site, check the snares, and gather more food. Always practical, always controlled. But Lena had seen beneath that control now, had seen him smile and fight and protect without calculation, had seen the human beneath the armor. That night, sleeping under the emergency blanket in their improved shelter, Lena found herself acutely aware of Adrian's presence 3 feet away, the sound of his breathing, the warmth of another human in the darkness, the knowledge that if danger came, he would face it first. When had everything changed? Was it the crash, the bear, or had it been changing slowly since the moment their eyes met in that falling aircraft when all pretense was stripped away, and they saw each other clearly for the first time? She didn't know, didn't have answers, but she knew with certainty that the Adrian Voss sleeping beside her now was nothing like the man she'd thought she hated. He was complicated and scarred and brilliant in ways that had nothing to do with business acumen. He was real. And despite everything, despite the danger and the wilderness and the impossibility of their situation, or maybe because of it, Lena found herself caring whether he survived, not just for her own sake, but for his. When had that happened? The question followed her into sleep, unanswered but persistent. Outside, the forest breathed around them. Stars wheeled overhead. And 2 people who'd barely known each other a week ago slept side by side, their survival bound together by circumstance and choice, and something neither of them was ready to name. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, they were safe. Together. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. The pattern of days settled into something almost rhythmic over the next 2 weeks. Wake at dawn, check snares. Purify water, tend the fire. Search for food, improve the shelter. Watch the sky for aircraft that never came. Sleep in shifts, always one awake, always vigilant against the forest's dangers. But beneath the routine, something was changing between them. Lena noticed it in small moments, the way Adrian's hand would steady her when she stumbled on uneven ground, lingering a fraction longer than necessary. The way his eyes would track her movements when he thought she wasn't looking. The careful way he portioned food, always making sure she got enough even if it meant he went without. She noticed it in herself too. The flutter in her chest when he smiled, which he did more often now. The way she'd started paying attention to the timbre of his voice, the precise movements of his hands as he worked. The fierce protectiveness she felt when she saw him wince from his still healing ribs. This wasn't the man from the office. Or maybe it was, stripped of all the armor he'd built to survive in a different kind of wilderness. "You're staring," Adrian said without looking up from the fish trap he was constructing by the stream. Lena felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm observing. There's a difference." "Is there?" Now he did look up, and there was something in his eyes, amusement mixed with awareness. He knew she was watching him differently, thinking about him differently. "What conclusions has your observation yielded?" "That you're surprisingly good at survival for a CEO." "And here I thought CEOs were all about survival, just different predators." He tied off the last piece of cordage on the trap. "This should work. Fish follow the current, swim into the narrow end, can't find their way back out." "Where did you learn that?" "Books, mostly. After my uncle died." He lowered the trap into the water, securing it with stones. "I read everything I could about survival, wilderness medicine, tracking, as if knowing it all could—" He trailed off. "Could what?" "Could mean I'd never be helpless again." He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. His suit pants were ruined, torn, and stained beyond recognition. His shirt was in worse shape, but somehow he carried himself with the same quiet authority he'd had in boardrooms. "Control through knowledge. It's been my strategy for everything." "Is it working?" Lena asked quietly. "Out here?" Adrian looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know anymore. Out here, the more I try to control, the more I realize how little control we actually have." He gestured at the endless forest around them. "We can prepare, can improve our odds, but ultimately we're at the mercy of forces so much bigger than us." It was the most vulnerable thing she'd heard him say. No pretense, no deflection, just honest uncertainty. "That's terrifying," Lena said. "Yes." He moved closer, and she could see fatigue in the lines around his eyes, the shadow of beard on his jaw. They'd both lost weight in 2 weeks, their bodies burning through reserves. But there was something else in his expression, too, something that made her breath catch. "But somehow less terrifying with you here." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning neither of them seemed ready to fully acknowledge. Lena felt her pulse quicken, felt the careful distance they'd maintained start to dissolve. "Adrian." A sound cut through the moment, the distant throb of rotors. Helicopter. They both froze, heads snapping toward the sky. There, visible through a gap in the canopy, a speck moving against clouds. Search and rescue. Had to be. "The signal mirror!" Lena was already running, stumbling over roots in her haste. Adrian was right behind her, both of them racing to their shelter where they kept the emergency supplies. Adrian grabbed the mirror while Lena kicked dirt over the fire, smothering it. Within seconds, thick white smoke began billowing upward, their distress signal, practiced but never used until now. Adrian positioned himself in a clearing, angling the mirror to catch sunlight, sending flashes toward the helicopter. "Come on," Lena breathed, watching the aircraft. "Come on, see us. Please see us." The helicopter continued on its path, moving steadily northeast. No course change, no circling, just straight flight that would take it past them in less than a minute. "Here!" Lena screamed, knowing it was useless but unable to stop herself. "We're here!" Adrian flashed the mirror frantically, over and over, creating strobes of reflected light. But the helicopter was too far, the canopy too thick. Even with the smoke, even with the mirror, they were just another piece of forest from that altitude. They watched in helpless silence as the helicopter passed, its sound gradually fading until the forest swallowed it completely. Then there was nothing but birdsong and the whisper of wind through leaves and the crushing weight of missed opportunity. Lena sank to the ground, something breaking inside her chest. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of survival, of hope maintained through sheer determination, and rescue had passed right over them without seeing. Hey! Adrian was beside her suddenly, his hand on her shoulder. Hey, it's okay. It's not okay. Her voice cracked. They were right there, and they didn't see us. Which means they're looking. They haven't given up. He knelt in front of her, forcing her to meet his eyes. One helicopter means there will be others. We just need to be ready next time. What if there isn't a next time? What if that was it? The fear she'd been holding back for 2 weeks came pouring out. What if they stop looking and we're stuck here when winter comes, and we freeze to death or starve or… Lena! His hands were on her face now, cupping her cheeks, grounding her. Look at me. We are not going to die here. Do you understand? We survived a plane crash. We survived a bear. We've survived 2 weeks in conditions that would have killed most people in 2 days. We're not giving up now. You can't promise that. No, he agreed quietly. But I can promise I will do everything in my power to keep you alive. And I need you to promise the same. Can you do that? She looked into his eyes, those gray eyes that had seemed so cold in the office, but now held warmth and determination and something fiercer. He meant it, every word. He would fight for their survival with the same ruthless focus he'd once applied to business deals. I promise, she whispered. Something shifted in his expression. His thumb brushed her cheek, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. For a moment, they stayed frozen like that, his hands cradling her face, their bodies close enough that she could feel his warmth, see the exact moment his gaze dropped to her lips. Then he pulled back abruptly, releasing her and standing in one smooth motion. We should build a better signal, something more visible from the air. The moment shattered. Lena felt its loss like a physical thing, but she nodded and stood, brushing dirt from her clothes. Whatever had almost happened, Adrian had chosen not to let it, had retreated behind control again. Maybe he was right to. Getting emotionally entangled when survival was uncertain would only complicate things, would only make loss harder if one of them didn't make it. But the thought of not making it hurt more now, because it wouldn't just be her death or his, it would be losing this, whatever this was becoming between them. They spent the afternoon constructing a massive SOS from white aircraft debris in the largest clearing they could find. It took hours of hard labor, dragging metal pieces, arranging them carefully, making sure the letters would be visible from altitude. By the time they finished, both of them were exhausted, covered in dirt and sweat. It's good, Adrian said, surveying their work. Large enough to see, distinct enough to recognize as man-made. Assuming anyone flies over again. They will. He said it with such certainty that Lena almost believed him. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. They huddled close to the fire, the emergency blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Lena couldn't stop shivering despite the flames. Come here. Adrian's voice was quiet. She looked up to find him opening his side of the blanket, creating space beside him. An invitation born of pure practicality. Shared body heat would keep them both warmer. But her heart still raced as she moved closer, tucking herself against his side. He was warm, solid. His arm came around her shoulders, pulling her tighter against him, and Lena felt something in her chest unclench. This wasn't romance. This was survival. Two people keeping each other alive through a cold night. But it didn't feel like just survival. Better? Adrian's voice rumbled in his chest, vibrating against her ear. Yes. It came out barely a whisper. They sat like that as the fire burned low, neither speaking. Lena could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, could feel the rise and fall of his breathing, could smell smoke and pine and something distinctly him underneath it all. I was wrong about you, Adrian said suddenly, breaking the silence. In the office, I thought you were limited, talented at design, but nothing beyond that. I was very wrong. Lena tilted her head to look at him. You thought I was limited? I thought everyone was limited. Easier to keep people in boxes, assign them roles, not expect more than what served my purposes. His jaw tightened. I was wrong about a lot of things. Like what? Like believing control was the same as strength. Like thinking distance was protection. He looked down at her, and in the firelight his eyes were storm dark. Like assuming I could survive anything alone. You're not alone, Lena said softly. No. His arm tightened around her. I'm not. And that terrifies me more than anything this forest has thrown at us. Why? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, because caring about someone gives them the power to destroy you. And I swore I'd never give anyone that power again. Who destroyed you before? The question slipped out before Lena could stop it. Adrian's expression shuddered slightly, but he didn't pull away. My mother left when I was 8. Said she couldn't handle my father's instability, the constant financial crises. She chose stability over us. His voice was flat, emotionless, but Lena could hear the old pain beneath it. My father spiraled, made worse decisions, lost everything, then drank himself to death when I was 22. I'm sorry. Don't be. It taught me valuable lessons, that love makes people vulnerable, that attachment is liability, that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself. Is that really what you believe? Lena asked quietly. It's what I believed. He looked at her steadily. I'm not sure what I believe anymore. The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. Lena's breath caught as she realized what he was saying, that she was changing him, that these weeks had cracked something open in his carefully constructed walls. Adrian! A sound cut through the night. Not the helicopter this time. Something closer, something moving through the undergrowth with heavy, deliberate steps. They both froze. Adrian's hand went immediately to the makeshift spear they kept nearby, a sturdy branch with metal from the aircraft lashed to the end. Lena felt her heart hammering as the sounds grew closer. Stay behind me, Adrian whispered, shifting position to place himself between her and the darkness beyond their fire's light. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched, broken only by the crack and pop of burning wood. Then, at the edge of the firelight, eyes reflected back at them. Not one pair. Multiple, low to the ground, spreading out in a semicircle. Wolves. Lena's blood turned to ice. She'd seen the tracks, had known wolves inhabited these forests. But seeing them, seeing the intelligent calculation in those eyes as they assessed their prey, was entirely different from abstract knowledge. How many? She whispered. 4, maybe 5. Adrian's voice was steady, but she could feel the tension in his body. They're testing us, seeing if we're worth the risk. Are we? We're going to make sure we're not. He reached for the fire, pulling out a burning branch. When I move, you grab another torch. We make ourselves big, loud, dangerous. Show them we're not easy prey. The wolves circled slowly, their movements coordinated. Pack hunters. Intelligent. Patient. One of them, larger than the others, the alpha, probably, took a step closer, lips pulling back to reveal teeth designed for tearing flesh. Adrian stood slowly, keeping the burning branch between them and the wolves. Now! Lena grabbed a torch and stood, making herself as large as possible. Adrian began shouting, waving the fire, and she joined him, screaming wordlessly, creating chaos and noise and the impression of dangerous, unpredictable prey. The wolves hesitated. The alpha snarled, but didn't advance. For several tense seconds, they held their ground, the balance teetering between attack and retreat. Then Adrian did something that stopped Lena's heart. He charged forward, straight at the alpha, fire thrust before him like a weapon. The alpha broke first. It turned and melted into darkness, and the rest of the pack followed instantly, disappearing as if they'd never been there at all. But Adrian didn't stop, didn't come back to the fire. Instead, he ran into the forest after them, still shouting, still carrying the torch. Adrian! Lena's scream tore through the night. What are you doing? No answer, just the sound of him crashing through undergrowth, growing more distant. Terror like nothing she'd felt before seized Lena's chest. He'd gone after them, had left the safety of the fire to chase wolves into the darkness. Was he insane? Was he trying to get himself killed? She couldn't leave the fire, couldn't abandon their shelter, but she also couldn't just stand here while he... A scream. Human. Adrian's voice, raw with pain and fury. Lena didn't think. She grabbed the spear and ran. The forest was a nightmare of shadows and shapes that could be threats or trees. Branches tore at her face, roots tried to trip her, but she kept running, following the sounds of struggle ahead. Her torch illuminated fragments, crushed undergrowth, scattered pine needles, signs of violence. Then she saw him. Adrian was on the ground, the torch fallen beside him, still burning. One of the wolves, not the alpha, but one of the others, had circled back, had its jaws locked on his leg. He was fighting it with desperate strength, his hands around its neck trying to force it back. Lena didn't hesitate. She ran forward and drove the spear into the wolf's flank with every ounce of strength she possessed. The wolf yelped and released Adrian, spinning to face this new threat. Blood ran from the wound she'd inflicted, but it wasn't deep enough, wasn't fatal. The wolf's eyes locked on her, and she saw her death in them. Then Adrian was moving. Despite his injured leg, despite the pain that must have been screaming through his body, he grabbed the torch and swung it directly into the wolf's face. Fur ignited. The animal's yelp became a howl of agony as it fled into darkness, the smell of burning hair acrid in the air. Silence fell. Just their ragged breathing and the crackle of the fallen torch. "You're an idiot," Lena said, her voice shaking. "You absolute, complete idiot." Adrian tried to stand and couldn't. His leg gave out, and he collapsed back to the ground with a curse. "I had to make sure they wouldn't come back. Had to establish dominance, show them where... You could have died!" She was kneeling beside him now, examining his leg in the torchlight. His pants were shredded, blood soaking through. The wolf's teeth had torn flesh, though thankfully it looked like muscle damage, not arterial. "You ran into the forest after wolves. What were you thinking?" "I was thinking I needed to protect you." The words burst from him with raw intensity. "I was thinking if I didn't chase them off completely, they'd come back. And next time I might not be able to stop them before they hurt you, and I can't..." He stopped abruptly, jaw clenching. "Can't what?" Lena demanded, even as she tore strips from her already ruined shirt to bind his wound. "Can't lose you." The admission came out rough, barely a whisper. "I can't lose you, Lena. I know that's not logical. I know attachment is liability. I know all the reasons why caring is dangerous. But I can't help it anymore. Out here, stripped of everything, you're all that matters." The words hit her like a physical force. This was what they'd been dancing around for days, what had been building between them since that first shared night by the fire. This was the truth beneath every loaded glance, every moment of protectiveness, every choice to fight rather than flee. "You complete idiot," she said again, but this time her voice broke. "You beautiful, stupid, reckless idiot." Then she kissed him. It wasn't gentle, wasn't tentative or questioning. It was fierce and desperate and full of 2 weeks of fear and survival and the absolute terror of almost losing him. His hand came up to tangle in her hair, pulling her closer despite his injured leg, despite the blood and dirt and the fact that they were still in danger in the middle of the forest. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. "We need to get back to the fire." "Can you walk?" "I'll crawl if I have to." But with her help, he managed to stand, leaning heavily on her shoulder. They made their way back slowly, tortuously, every step drawing a hiss of pain from him. At the fire, Lena cleaned and bandaged his leg properly using their limited medical supplies. The wounds were bad, but not as terrible as they could have been. He'd need to stay off it for days to heal properly, which meant she'd have to take over most of the physical work of survival. "I'm sorry," Adrian said as she tied off the last bandage. "That was reckless." Yes, it was. She sat back looking at him in the firelight. "Don't do it again." "I can't promise that." His eyes were serious. "If it comes down to your safety or my caution, I'll choose your safety every time. Then I guess I'll have to keep saving you from your own heroics." She settled beside him, careful not to jar his leg. "Someone has to keep you alive." His arm came around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Is this real?" he asked quietly. "Or is it just survival instinct? Two people clinging to each other because we're all we have?" Lena considered the question seriously. Was this real, or was it circumstance, proximity, the human need for connection when death felt close? She thought about the office, about the 3 years she'd spent resenting him, never once imagining she could feel anything else. But the man holding her now wasn't the man from the office. Or maybe he was, just finally allowed to be more than the armor he wore. Out here, with everything stripped away, she'd seen who Adrian Voss actually was beneath the control and distance. Had seen his strength and vulnerability and the fierce capacity for protection he'd hidden behind cold calculation. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe it started as survival, but it doesn't feel like just survival anymore. No, he agreed softly. It doesn't. They sat together as the fire burned low, neither speaking, just existing in shared space. Lena's mind replayed the last hour, the wolves, Adrian's reckless charge, the moment she thought she'd lost him. The kiss that had felt like both beginning and continuation of something she didn't fully understand yet. Tomorrow, they'd have to figure out what this meant. Tomorrow, they'd have to deal with Adrian's injury, with the increased difficulty of survival now that he was limited. Tomorrow, they'd have to keep watching the sky, keep hoping for rescue, keep fighting to stay alive. But tonight, in this moment, they had each other. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough to make survival feel like more than just not dying. It felt like something worth fighting for. 3 days after the wolf attack, Adrian's fever broke. Lena had spent those 72 hours in a state of controlled terror, watching him slip in and out of delirium while infection ravaged his body despite her best efforts with their limited antibiotics from the emergency kit. She'd kept the wounds clean, changed bandages religiously, forced water and the last of their precious aspirin down his throat. She'd hunted and gathered alone, maintained the fire alone, kept watch alone while he thrashed and muttered through nightmares. When his eyes finally opened clear, focused, and fever-free on the fourth morning, Lena felt something break inside her chest. "Hey," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You look terrible." A laugh escaped her, half relief, half hysteria. "You've been unconscious for 3 days with a raging infection, and you're critiquing my appearance?" Force of habit. But he reached for her hand, his fingers weak but warm. Normal warm, not the frightening heat of fever. "Thank you for keeping me alive." "You've done the same for me." She helped him sit up slowly, supporting his back. "How do you feel?" "Like I fought a wolf and lost." He looked down at his bandaged leg, then at the shelter around them. "You've been managing alone." "I had a good teacher." She gestured to the neat pile of firewood, the full water containers, the fish drying on a makeshift rack. "Turns out I'm more capable than either of us thought." Pride flickered across his face, mixed with something deeper. "I never doubted your capability. I just didn't let myself see it." Over the next week, as Adrian healed and regained strength, their dynamic shifted again. He couldn't do heavy work yet, so Lena took on most of the physical tasks while he handled planning and preparation from the shelter. It was strange seeing him vulnerable, dependent on her in ways that would have been unthinkable a month ago. But he didn't fight it, didn't try to hide his weakness or pretend he was fine, just accepted help with quiet grace that told Lena more about how much he'd changed than any words could have. "Tell me something," he said one evening as they shared a dinner of fish and cattail roots. "If we get rescued tomorrow, what's the first thing you'll do?" Lena considered the question. A month ago, she would have said, take a hot shower, eat real food, sleep in a real bed. But now those comforts seemed less important than something else. "I'd make sure you got proper medical attention for that leg," she said. Adrian's expression softened. After that, "I don't know, everything seems," she struggled for the right words, "different now. The life I had before, the apartment, the job, the routines. It all feels like it belonged to someone else." "I know what you mean." He poked at the fire with a stick. "I keep thinking about going back to the office, to board meetings and quarterly reports, and I can't imagine it. Can't imagine putting the mask back on, playing the role I created." "What would you do instead?" "I don't know." The admission seemed to cost him something. "For the first time in my life, I genuinely don't know what comes next. And that should terrify me, but somehow," he looked at her directly, "somehow it doesn't." The silence that followed felt full of unspoken things. Lena wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to define whatever was happening between them, but something held her back. Out here, they could exist in this undefined space, could be whatever they needed to be without labels or expectations. But in the real world, he was still Adrian Voss, CEO and heir to a massive fortune. And she was still the designer who'd worked for him, who'd been so far below his notice that he hadn't learned her first name until they crashed. Could what they'd found here survive that reality? The question haunted her as days passed. Adrian grew stronger, able to walk short distances with a makeshift crutch. They fell into new rhythms, working together, talking through long evenings by the fire, sleeping curled against each other for warmth that had become about more than just survival. And Lena fell deeper. She couldn't help it. Every day revealed new layers to the man she'd thought she knew, his dry humor, his unexpected tenderness, the way he watched her like she was the most fascinating thing in his world. The way he listened when she talked, really listened, absorbing her words like they mattered. She'd never felt seen like this before. Never felt like her thoughts and observations had weight, had value beyond their utility. With Adrian, she wasn't just competent or useful, she was essential. But the fear lingered. What happened when rescue came? When the helicopter finally saw their signal and pulled them back to civilization? Would this, whatever this was, survive the transition? The question became urgent when, on their 31st day in the wilderness, they heard it again. Helicopter rotors. Close this time. Very close. They scrambled to the signal clearing, Lena supporting Adrian's weight as he moved faster than was probably wise on his healing leg. The smoke was already billowing from their prepared signal fire, and Adrian had the mirror positioned before the helicopter even came into view. But this time was different. This time, when the aircraft appeared over the tree line, it didn't continue past. It circled, slowed. The pilot had seen them. Lena screamed, waving her arms frantically. Beside her, Adrian flashed the mirror in the precise pattern that meant distress, SOS, help needed. The helicopter descended, finding a clearing a quarter-mile away to land. They were being rescued. The thought should have brought pure relief. Instead, Lena felt something tighten around her heart. Fear mixed with the joy, uncertainty tangled with gratitude. "We made it," Adrian said quietly, his hand finding hers. "We actually made it." "Yes." She turned to look at him, this man who'd become everything to her in 31 impossible days. "We did." His fingers tightened on hers. "Lena!" But there was no time. The rescue team was approaching through the forest, voices calling out, asking if they could walk, if they needed medical assistance. How many survivors? 2, Lena thought, as uniformed men and women surrounded them with practiced efficiency. 2 survivors. But were they the same people who'd boarded that plane 5 weeks ago? Or had those people died in the crash, replaced by these versions who knew how to make fire and set snares and face down bears? The helicopter ride to the hospital was a blur of noise and motion. Paramedics checked their vitals, started IVs, asked questions Lena answered automatically. Across the small space, Adrian received similar attention, but his eyes kept finding hers, holding her gaze like an anchor. They were separated at the hospital, different rooms for examination, different doctors asking different questions. Lena submitted to it all numbly, barely registering the fuss over her injuries, the relief in voices telling her how lucky she was, how miraculous their survival had been. All she could think about was Adrian. Was he okay? Was his leg worse than they'd thought? Was he in pain? Was he already slipping back into being the CEO she'd known, leaving behind the man she'd fallen for? Her father's sister arrived that evening, Aunt Mary, who Lena hadn't seen in 2 years but who wrapped her in a fierce hug and cried and said she'd been so worried that everyone had been so worried. "The search went on for weeks," Mary explained, sitting beside Lena's hospital bed. "They found the crash site 10 days ago, but no sign of survivors. They were about to call it off when a pilot spotted your signal this morning." 10 days ago. They'd been living and surviving while searchers had given up hope. The timing was dizzying. "There's been media everywhere," Mary continued. "The story of the Voss Industries CEO surviving a crash, it's all over the news. His family has been, well, they've been very present." Something in her tone made Lena's stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" Mary hesitated. "Honey, Adrian Voss is worth billions. His mother and stepfather showed up the moment the rescue was confirmed. They've been managing the narrative, controlling access. The hospital is swarming with security." Billions. The word felt surreal. Lena had known Voss Industries was successful, but she'd never really considered the scale. Never thought about what it meant that Adrian wasn't just wealthy, but generationally, dynastically wealthy. Never thought about what it meant that she was... What? What was she to him, really, outside the context of survival? I want to see him, Lena said. Honey, I don't think that's possible. The security around his room, I don't care about the security. Lena sat up despite her body's protests. I need to see him. But Mary was right. Adrian's floor was locked down. Security guards posted at strategic points. The head of hospital security was polite but immovable. Only family approved by the Voss estate could visit. Ms. Carter was not on that list. Lena stood in the hallway, staring at the guards, feeling the distance between her and Adrian as a physical thing. 31 days of shared survival, and now they were separated by 10 feet and an unbridgeable gulf of money and power and the reality they'd been avoiding. She made it back to her room before the tears came. 2 days passed. Lena was cleared for discharge with instructions for follow-up care and physical therapy. She'd lost 15 pounds, had bruising and scarring that would take months to fully heal, but was otherwise remarkably healthy considering the circumstances. She'd heard nothing from Adrian, no messages, no visits, just silence from the man who'd sworn he couldn't lose her, who'd risked his life to protect her, who'd held her through cold nights and looked at her like she was his entire world. Maybe that had only been true in the wilderness. Maybe, back in civilization, reality had reasserted itself. He was Adrian Voss, CEO and billionaire. She was Lena Carter, employee and nobody. The thought hurt more than any of her physical injuries. Aunt Mary drove her home to the apartment Lena had left over a month ago for what was supposed to be a simple business flight. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. Her laptop still sitting on the kitchen counter, coffee cup still in the sink, mail piled up inside the door. It felt like a museum of someone else's life. You should rest, Mary said, hovering anxiously. Doctor's orders. I can stay if you want, or I'm okay. Lena forced a smile. Really, I just need some time to adjust. After Mary left, Lena wandered her apartment like a ghost. Nothing felt real. Not the soft carpet under her feet, or the hum of the refrigerator, or the city sounds filtering through windows. Reality was fire and forest, and the sound of a stream over stones. Reality was Adrian's voice in the darkness saying her name. This was just the illusion she'd have to learn to live with again. Her phone, charging for the first time in weeks, buzzed with notifications, hundreds of them. Messages from friends and acquaintances, many from people she barely knew, all expressing shock and relief and morbid curiosity. She scrolled through them mechanically until one caught her eye. From her former supervisor at Voss Industries. So glad you're safe. HR needs you to call regarding your employment status. Employment status. Right. Because she'd been scheduled to work, had missed over a month, and technically was still an employee of a company whose CEO she'd, fallen for, slept beside, kissed once in a moment of desperate emotion. She didn't call HR. Instead, she opened news articles about the rescue, needing to see if Adrian was mentioned, needing to know he was okay even if he'd apparently forgotten she existed. The articles were everywhere. Photos of the helicopter landing at the hospital, speculation about the crash investigation, and buried in several stories. Adrian Voss, 34, CEO of Voss Industries, was accompanied by a company employee in the crash. Both survived the ordeal. The employee's name has not been released. A company employee. Not even her name. Just a footnote in his story. Lena closed the browser and sat in the growing darkness of her apartment, feeling the weight of reality settle over her like a shroud. This was how it ended. Not with closure or explanation, but with silence and distance and the slow understanding that what had happened in the forest stayed in the forest. The knock on her door came 3 days later. Lena almost didn't answer it. She'd been existing in a fog since coming home, going through motions without feeling anything, eating because she had to, sleeping because exhaustion eventually claimed her, existing because the alternative was unthinkable, but not because she particularly wanted to. But the knock came again, more insistent, and she dragged herself to the door. Adrian stood in her hallway. Not the Adrian from the forest. This version wore an expensive suit, had his hair properly cut, looked every inch the CEO she remembered from before. But his eyes were the same. Those storm-gray eyes that had seen her, really seen her, in the wilderness. Hi, he said quietly. Lena couldn't speak, couldn't process that he was here, in her apartment, looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Can I come in?" he asked. She stepped back wordlessly, and he entered, his gait only slightly uneven from the leg injury. He looked around her small apartment, taking in the modest furniture, the single bedroom visible through an open door, the life that was so far from his own it might as well have been a different planet. "You look good," he said finally. "Healthy. So do you." Her voice came out rough. "I heard you were released from the hospital 2 days ago." "Yes, there were complications. With my family, with the company. Things I had to handle before I could—" He turned to face her fully. "Before I could do what I should have done immediately. Which was? Come to you." He took a step closer. "Lena, I know how this looks. I know it seems like I abandoned you, like the moment we got back to civilization, I forgot everything that happened, but it wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" The question came out sharper than she intended. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like that. 5 weeks of survival, of partnership, of—" She couldn't say it. Couldn't name what they'd been to each other when she still didn't know if it had been real. "Of falling in love with you," Adrian finished quietly. "That's what you can't say, isn't it? Because you're not sure if I feel the same. If anything we had out there was real or just survival instinct." The words hung between them. Lena felt her heart hammering, felt tears threatening. "Was it?" she whispered. "Was any of it real?" "Every moment." He crossed to her in 2 strides, his hands coming up to cup her face exactly like he had that night by the fire. "Every word I said, every promise I made, every time I looked at you and felt like you were the only thing keeping me human, all of it was real. More real than anything in my life before." "Then why?" The tears fell now, hot against her cheeks. "Why the silence? Why make me feel like I was nothing?" Pain crossed his face. "Because the moment we landed, my mother and her husband descended, started making decisions about my care, my recovery, the company. They controlled access to me, managed communications, made sure the right narrative was being told." His jaw tightened. "They wanted me focused on Voss Industries, on recovering my position. They saw you as a distraction, a liability. So you let them." "For 3 days, yes. Because I was recovering and overwhelmed and slipping back into old patterns of letting others manage things while I controlled the big picture." He pulled her closer. "But then I realized what I was doing. Realized I was letting them take from me the one thing that actually mattered. So I told them to go to hell." Lena's breath caught. "You what?" "I told them I was done letting other people dictate my life. That I'd spent 34 years building walls and maintaining control and following the path laid out for me. And where had it gotten me? To a plane crash in a forest and the realization that everything I thought mattered was meaningless compared to one woman who saw me at my worst and somehow made me want to be better." "Adrian, I'm not going back to Voss Industries," he said, the words tumbling out now like he'd been holding them back too long. "Not as CEO, not in the role they expect. I'm restructuring everything, putting in new leadership, changing the company culture, making it about more than just profit and control, because that person I was before, he's gone. He died in that crash. And I don't want to resurrect him." Lena could barely breathe. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm choosing you." His voice was fierce, certain. "I'm choosing the life we could have together over the life I'm expected to live. I'm choosing to build something real instead of maintaining something hollow. I'm choosing to let someone in, to be vulnerable, to risk the thing that terrifies me most." "Which is?" "Loving you completely." His thumbs brushed her tears away. "And trusting that you might love me back." The words broke something open in Lena's chest. All the fear, all the uncertainty, all the pain of the last days dissolved in the face of his raw honesty. This was the man from the forest, the one who'd fought bears and wolves to protect her, who'd held her through cold nights, who'd stripped away every defense to show her who he really was. And he was choosing her. "I do love you," she said, the words feeling both terrifying and inevitable. "I think I started loving you the moment you made fire out of nothing and looked at me like I mattered. Like I was more than just an employee or a burden or—" He kissed her, cutting off the words with the fierce tenderness she remembered from that desperate night in the forest. But this kiss was different. This one wasn't born from fear of loss, but from certainty of choice. This was a kiss that said beginning, not ending. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. "I bought a house," he said. "Small place in the mountains. No cell service. Closest town is 40 miles away. Thought maybe we could—" He hesitated, vulnerability clear in his expression. "Thought maybe we could figure out what comes next from there. Together." Lena pulled back to look at him, seeing the question in his eyes. He was offering her everything, not his wealth or his name or the trappings of his former life, but himself. The real him, stripped of pretense, asking if she wanted to build something new. "Yes," she said simply. Relief and joy transformed his face. "Yes? Yes to the mountains. Yes to figuring it out together. Yes to all of it." She smiled through tears. "But I have one condition. Anything. No more running into the forest after wolves." He laughed, a real laugh, full and genuine and so different from any sound she'd heard from him in the office. "I'll do my best, but I can't promise I won't do stupid things to protect you. It seems to be hardwired now." "Then I'll just have to keep saving you from yourself." She kissed him again, softer this time. "Someone has to." Over the next weeks, they built their exit from the lives they'd lived before. Adrian restructured Voss Industries with methodical precision, installing leaders who shared his new vision and divesting himself of the day-to-day control that had consumed him. He kept a board position, maintained oversight, but stepped back from the role that had defined him. Lena resigned from her position, though Adrian insisted on a severance package that made her uncomfortable until he pointed out she'd earned it through 3 years of excellent work and a month of keeping him alive. She accepted it finally, understanding it as closure rather than charity. The media had a field day with the story when it broke. CEO steps down. Couple who survived crashed together, now building a life away from the spotlight. Speculation ran rampant about their relationship, about Adrian's decision, about what it meant for the company. They ignored all of it. Let the world speculate and judge and create whatever narrative it wanted. The truth was simpler and more complicated than any story the media could tell. 2 people had crashed in a forest and found something more valuable than survival. Now they were choosing to protect it. The mountain house was everything Adrian had promised. Remote, beautiful, surrounded by forests that felt like both memory and promise. They moved in together 2 months after the rescue, carrying minimal possessions into a space that felt vast with possibility. "What do we do now?" Lena asked on their first night, standing on the porch and watching sunset paint the mountains gold. Adrian's arm came around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "Whatever we want," he said. "That's the point. We get to choose who we become now." And they did choose. Chose to wake with the sun and sleep when exhaustion claimed them. Chose to cook meals together and maintain the skills they'd learned in survival. Chose to talk through long evenings about dreams and fears and the future they were building one day at a time. Chose each other over and over in ways both small and profound. 3 months after moving to the mountains, Adrian led Lena to a clearing overlooking a valley. The view was spectacular. Endless forest and distant peaks and sky so vast it made her feel both insignificant and infinite. "This is where I want to ask you something," he said, turning to face her. Lena's breath caught as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple ring. Not diamonds or ostentatious wealth, but a band carved from wood with delicate inlays of stone. "I made this," he said, "from a tree in the forest where we crashed, and stones from the stream where you found water. Because those things, the forest, the survival, the moment everything changed, they're part of us now, part of our story." Tears blurred her vision. "Adrian, marry me," he said simply, "not because it's expected or because it's what people do, but because I want to spend the rest of my life choosing you. Because you're the only person who's ever seen all of me, the control and the fear and the man underneath, and somehow loved me anyway." "I love you because of all of it," Lena said, her voice breaking. "Not anyway." "Because." "So is that a yes?" She kissed him instead of answering, poured every emotion into it, the love and gratitude and wonder that this was her life now, that they'd survived death to find this. That the man who'd seemed so cold and untouchable had become the warmth she built her world around. "Yes," she said when they finally broke apart. Yes to forever. Yes to choosing each other. Yes to all of it. He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. This symbol of their journey, carved from the very wilderness that had transformed them. Lena looked at it through tears, then at the man who'd made it, and felt certainty settle into her bones. They didn't just survive the wilderness. They'd survived the return to civilization, the pressure to resume old lives, the forces that tried to push them apart. They'd fought for this, for each other. With the same determination they'd applied to making fire and finding food and facing down predators. And they'd won. Standing in that clearing with mountains rising around them and the man she loved holding her like she was precious, Lena understood finally what they'd really survived. They'd survived becoming the people they were always meant to be. The ring felt both weightless and substantial on Lena's finger as they walked back to the house, her hand entwined with Adrian's. The wood was smooth against her skin, warmed by her body heat, and every time she glanced at it, she felt the enormity of what they'd chosen settling into something real and solid. "We should call people," she said as they reached the porch. "Tell them. My aunt, at least. Maybe some friends." Adrian paused, his expression thoughtful. "There's someone I need to tell first, someone who deserves to hear it directly." "Your mother?" "No." His jaw tightened slightly. "My uncle's daughter, my cousin Sarah. She was the only family member who didn't try to control things after the rescue. She just cared. Asked if I was okay. Meant it when she said it." It was the first time he'd mentioned extended family beyond his mother and stepfather. Lena squeezed his hand. "Then we'll call her together." "Sure." But before they could reach the phone, they heard it, the sound of a vehicle coming up the long dirt road to their house. Unusual, given how remote they were. Lena felt Adrian tense beside her, his protective instincts immediately engaged. A black SUV emerged from the trees, expensive and out of place against the rustic mountain backdrop. It pulled to a stop in front of the house, and a woman stepped out, elegant, mid-50s, with Adrian's sharp features softened by age and what looked like carefully maintained composure. His mother. "Adrian," her voice carried across the distance, cultured and cool. "We need to talk." Lena felt Adrian's hand tighten on hers, felt the way his entire body went rigid. This was the woman who'd tried to control his recovery, who'd kept them apart, who represented everything about his old life he'd been trying to leave behind. "There's nothing to talk about, Mother." His voice was flat, emotionless. The CEO voice Lena hadn't heard in months. "I made my decisions clear. And I'm here to tell you those decisions are destroying everything your father built." She moved closer, her heels impractical on the dirt driveway. Her eyes flicked to Lena, dismissive and cold. "Everything we built. The board is in chaos. Stock prices are fluctuating. You owe it to the family legacy to—" "I don't owe the family legacy anything." Adrian's voice cut through her words like a blade. "That legacy almost killed me. Literally. I was on that plane because I was flying to another merger, another acquisition, another step in building an empire I never wanted in the first place." His mother's face paled. "You don't mean that." "I do." He stepped forward, and Lena felt the protective fury radiating from him, but it wasn't directed at his mother. It was directed at the life she represented, the cage she'd helped build. "For 34 years, I did what was expected, built what you and Father wanted built, became who you needed me to be, and it made me into someone I barely recognized, someone cold and isolated and so obsessed with control that I couldn't see what actually mattered." "And what matters?" His mother's voice dripped with disdain. "Living in the woods with some employee throwing away everything you worked for?" "Her name is Lena." Adrian's voice was steel. "And yes, building a life with her matters more than any company ever could. She saw me at my absolute worst, injured, terrified, stripped of every defense, and she didn't run. Didn't try to control or manage or reshape me into something more palatable. She just stayed, fought beside me, saved my life more than once." Lena felt tears prick her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. His mother looked between them, something like calculation in her expression. "If it's about money," she said, turning to Lena, "I'm prepared to offer—" "Stop!" Adrian's command cracked like a whip. "You will not insult her. You will not try to buy her off. You will not treat this like a business negotiation. He took a breath, visibly controlling himself. I'm going to say this once, and I need you to actually hear it. I'm done. Done with Voss Industries as it was. Done with the family expectations. Done with letting you dictate my life. You're being childish. I'm being honest for the first time in my adult life. His arm came around Lena's waist, pulling her close. I found something in that wilderness that I never had before. Real connection. Real purpose. Someone who sees me as more than a name or a role or a means to maintaining family power. And I will not sacrifice that to make you comfortable. His mother's composure cracked slightly. Your father would be so disappointed. My father was a brilliant businessman and a terrible parent who taught me that love was conditional and trust was liability. Adrian's voice softened, but the steel remained. I spent my whole life trying to earn approval that was never coming. But I'm not that person anymore. The crash changed me. Lena changed me. And I'm grateful for both. Silence stretched between them. Lena watched emotions flicker across his mother's face. Anger, frustration, and underneath it all, something that might have been fear. Fear of losing him. Fear of losing control. Fear that the son she'd shaped was choosing a different path. If you do this, his mother said finally, if you continue down this path, there will be consequences. Financial, social. The family will not support this fantasy. I don't need your support. Adrian's voice was gentle but absolute. I have everything I need right here. His mother looked at them one more time, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and walked back to the SUV, her movement stiff with barely contained emotion. The vehicle pulled away, disappearing back down the dirt road, leaving silence in its wake. Adrian didn't move for a long moment. Then slowly Lena felt the tension drain from his body. He turned to her, and in his eyes she saw vulnerability mixed with certainty. That was harder than facing the bear, he said. Lena laughed despite herself, despite the intensity of what had just happened. But you did it. You actually did it. We did it. He pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. Everything's we now, remember? They stood like that for a while, holding each other as the sun moved across the sky and the mountains stood witness. This was the final bridge burned, the last tie to his old life severed. From here, there was only forward. Over the following weeks, they built their new life with intentional care. Adrian dove into the restructuring of Voss Industries with focused energy, but from a distance. Video calls and email rather than boardrooms, strategic guidance rather than daily control. He installed a CEO who shared his vision for transforming the company culture, who understood that success didn't have to come at the cost of humanity. And slowly, impossibly, it worked. The company stabilized under new leadership. Stock prices recovered. The board, initially resistant, began to see the value in Adrian's new approach. The innovation that came from treating employees as people rather than resources. The loyalty that developed when workers felt valued. You're still changing things, Lena observed one evening, watching him finish a video call with the new CEO. Just in a different way. I'm guiding instead of controlling. He closed his laptop with a satisfied click. Turns out you can have influence without having power over people. Who knew? Anyone who wasn't raised by your family? Lena suggested gently. He smiled, but there was old pain in it. Fair point. They fell into rhythms that felt both new and ancient, waking with the sun, working on projects that mattered to them personally rather than professionally, cooking meals that took time and care. Adrian started writing, documenting their survival experience not for publication, but for processing. Lena began designing again, but for small local businesses who needed help and couldn't afford big agencies, finding more satisfaction in their gratitude than she'd ever felt in corporate praise. They hiked the mountains they'd chosen as home, and sometimes the landscape reminded them of those 31 days in the wilderness. But the memories weren't traumatic anymore. They were foundational, the bedrock on which everything else was built. Do you ever regret it? Lena asked one afternoon as they sat by a stream that reminded her of the one where they'd found water. Giving up the company, the power, everything you worked for? Adrian considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything now, with thoughtfulness rather than calculation. I regret the years I wasted building something I didn't actually want, but giving it up? He shook his head. That's the best decision I've ever made. Second best, anyway. What's the best? Fighting the bear instead of running. At her incredulous look, he laughed. I'm kidding. The best decision was choosing to see you. Really see you. Not just as an employee, but as the extraordinary person you are. Everything else follows from that. The wedding happened on a cool October morning, 6 months after the proposal. They kept it small. Aunt Mary, Adrian's cousin Sarah, and her family, a handful of close friends they'd made in the mountain community. No media. No society photographers. No orchestra or ice sculptures or any of the ostentatious displays Adrian's mother had undoubtedly expected. Just two people promising to continue choosing each other, witnessed by people who actually cared about their happiness. They married in the clearing where Adrian had proposed, with mountains rising around them and autumn painting the forest in golds and reds. Lena wore a simple dress she'd found in a small-town boutique, and Adrian wore a suit that wasn't designer but fit him better than anything from his old wardrobe ever had, because he'd chosen it himself, for himself. I didn't prepare vows, Adrian admitted when it was time, his hands holding hers, because everything I could say feels inadequate. How do you put into words what it means to have someone see your worst and still choose to stay? To have someone fight beside you, literally and metaphorically, and never ask for anything except your honesty? You try, Lena said softly, tears already forming. That's all either of us can do. He smiled, that genuine expression that still sometimes caught her off guard with its openness. Then I'll try. Lena Carter, you saved my life in that forest. But more than that, you saved me from the life I was living before, the half-existence where I was successful but never truly alive. You taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness, that letting someone in doesn't make you helpless, that love is worth the risk of loss. His voice caught slightly, and Lena squeezed his hands. You showed me who I could be when I stopped trying to control everything, he continued, and I promise to spend the rest of our lives becoming that person more fully. I promise to choose you every day, in ways both small and significant. I promise to face whatever comes next the way we face the wilderness, together, honest, and refusing to give up. Lena took a shaky breath, knowing her own vows couldn't match the raw honesty of his, but needing to try anyway. Adrian Voss, I spent 3 years thinking I knew who you were. Then we crashed, and I learned I'd been looking at a mask instead of a person. Thank you for trusting me enough to take the mask off. Thank you for showing me your fear and your strength and the complicated, brilliant, sometimes infuriating man underneath all the armor. He laughed wetly, and she realized he was crying too. I promise to keep seeing you, she said. Not the CEO or the billionaire or whatever role the world tries to put you in, but the man who makes fire from nothing and fights wolves and holds me through nightmares. I promise to be your partner in building this life we're creating. Equal, honest, and brave enough to keep choosing love even when it's terrifying. The officiant pronounced them married, and Adrian kissed her like they were the only two people in the world. Like they were back in the wilderness where none of this, the wedding, the witnesses, the promises, existed yet, and it was just them choosing each other for the first time. When they pulled apart, Lena looked at the small gathering and saw Sarah crying openly, Aunt Mary beaming, their friends applauding. This was family, not the toxic legacy Adrian had inherited, but the chosen connections they were building together. The celebration was simple: food they'd prepared themselves, wine from a local vineyard, music from Sarah's husband who played guitar. As evening approached and stars began emerging, Adrian pulled Lena into a dance, even though there was barely room in the clearing, even though neither of them were particularly graceful. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "That I'm grateful." His voice was quiet, meant only for her. That 31 days of hell gave me 31,000 days of this. That falling from the sky was the best thing that ever happened to me because it brought me to you. We almost died, Lena reminded him. I know, but we didn't. We survived and found each other and built something real. He pulled back slightly to look at her, and in his eyes she saw everything they'd been through together, the terror and triumph, the vulnerability and strength, the journey from strangers to partners to this. That's the legacy I want to leave. Not a company or a fortune, but proof that people can change, that it's never too late to choose differently. 3 months after the wedding, they took a trip. Not to some exotic destination or luxury resort, but back to the wilderness. Back to the mountains where they'd crashed, armed with proper gear this time, but driven by the need to face it again on their own terms. The crash site had been cleared by investigators, but evidence of it remained: scorched trees, disturbed earth, a few pieces of twisted metal too embedded to remove. Lena stood in the clearing where her seat had landed and felt the weight of impossibility all over again. She shouldn't have survived. Statistically, mathematically, logically, she should have died here. "You okay?" Adrian's hand found hers. "Yeah." She turned to him, this man who'd been a stranger when they fell from the sky and was now the center of her world. "I keep thinking about who we were then. How different everything was. Different bad or different good? Just different." She gestured at the forest around them. That Lena was scared and alone and had no idea what she was capable of. This Lena knows she can survive anything because she already has. They hiked to the stream where they'd found water, and it was exactly as Lena remembered, clear and cold and singing over stones. They sat on the bank, and Adrian pulled out the fish trap design he'd used, smiling at the memory. "Think it would still work?" Lena asked. "Only one way to find out." They spent the afternoon building a trap together, their movements coordinated from months of partnership. When they finally caught a small trout, they both laughed like it was the greatest achievement imaginable, which, in a way, it was. Proof that the skills they'd learned in desperation could be used in joy. That night, they camped in the wilderness properly, with a tent and sleeping bags and a stove, all the equipment they hadn't had before. But they still built a fire the old way, using the bow drill method Adrian had perfected. Still sat beside it talking into the darkness, still fell asleep with the sounds of the forest around them. "This doesn't scare you?" Lena asked as they lay in the tent, the forest alive with night sounds. "Being back here?" "The opposite." Adrian's arm tightened around her. "Being here reminds me that we survived the worst. Everything else is just details." They stayed 3 days, retracing their original path from the crash site to their shelter location to the clearings where they'd hunted and gathered. Every landmark was a memory, every tree a witness to their transformation. On the last day, they stood at the spot where Adrian had fought the wolf, where Lena had driven the spear into its flank, where they'd first acknowledged what they were becoming to each other. "Thank you," Adrian said quietly. "For what?" "For saving me. Not just from the wolf, but from myself." He turned to face her fully. "I meant what I said in my vows. You didn't just save my life, you saved me from the life I was living, from the prison I'd built out of control and fear and the belief that I had to do everything alone." Lena reached up to cup his face, feeling the roughness of several days' beard growth. "You saved me too. Showed me I was stronger than I knew, braver than I thought, capable of more than anyone ever expected from me." They left the wilderness holding hands, but they carried it with them, in the skills they'd learned, in the confidence they'd gained, in the knowledge that they'd faced death and chosen life together. The years that followed were full in ways their old lives had never been. Adrian's restructured role at Voss Industries proved sustainable. He provided strategic guidance and vision, while new leadership handled execution, creating a model that other companies began studying and emulating. The business press called it revolutionary. Adrian called it simply being human. Lena's design work evolved into something more substantial. She started a nonprofit teaching design skills to underprivileged youth, using creativity as a pathway to opportunity. Adrian's resources made it possible, but Lena's vision and dedication made it successful. Within 2 years, they'd helped hundreds of kids discover talents they didn't know they had. They built a life that honored both their pasts and their present, kept the mountain house, but also bought a small apartment in Seattle for when they needed to be in the city, maintained the survival skills they'd learned, but also embraced comfort and connection, stayed grounded in the reality of what they'd survived while building toward a future full of possibility. And through it all, they chose each other. Chose each other when Adrian's mother made one final attempt at reconciliation that was really an attempt at manipulation, and they had to set firm boundaries together. Chose each other when Lena's design nonprofit struggled financially, and Adrian wanted to simply fund it while Lena insisted on finding sustainable solutions. Chose each other through disagreements and doubts, and the inevitable friction of two strong people building one life. chose each other, especially in the quiet moments. Morning coffee on the porch, watching sunrise over mountains, evening walks through forests that no longer held terror, nights wrapped in each other's arms with the certainty that tomorrow they'd wake up and choose each other again. 2 years after their wedding, Lena woke in the mountain house to find Adrian already up, standing on the porch with coffee and an expression she'd learned to recognize. Contemplative but content, processing something significant. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, joining him with her own coffee. "Legacy." He gestured at the mountains, the forest, the vast wilderness stretching to horizons. "What we leave behind. What actually matters." Having an existential crisis before breakfast? He smiled. "More like an existential clarity. I spent so many years thinking legacy was about building something that lasted, a company, a fortune, a name people would remember. But now I think it's simpler than that." "What is it?" "It's this." He turned to her, and in his eyes she saw everything they'd built together. "It's knowing that we chose love over fear, that we took the terrifying leap of letting someone in completely, that we survived not just a crash, but the return to a world that wanted to keep us apart, and we refused to let it." Lena set her coffee down and moved into his arms, fitting against him like she'd been designed for exactly this space. "That's a pretty good legacy." "There's more." His hand moved to rest on her stomach, and Lena's breath caught as she understood what he was asking without words. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "We haven't talked about—" "I'm sure." His voice was steady, certain. "I want to build a family with you. Want to raise children who know they're loved unconditionally, who see partnership modeled in how we treat each other, who understand that strength comes from vulnerability and courage comes from choosing connection." Tears blurred Lena's vision. "I want that too." "Then let's choose it. The same way we chose everything else, honestly, deliberately, together." 6 months later, standing in the same clearing where they'd married, Lena told Adrian they were pregnant. She watched joy transform his face, watched him drop to his knees and press his forehead against her still flat stomach, watched him cry with happiness he no longer tried to hide. "Thank you," he whispered against her skin. "Thank you for this. For everything. For choosing me even when I didn't deserve it." "You always deserved it," Lena said, her hands in his hair. "You just didn't believe it yet." Their daughter was born on a spring morning, arriving with her father's gray eyes and her mother's determination. They named her Maya, for rebirth, for transformation, for the journey from who they'd been to who they'd become. Adrian held her with the same careful intensity he brought to everything that mattered, and Lena watched him whisper promises to this tiny person. Promises to always see her, to never make love conditional, to show her through example what partnership and courage looked like. "She's perfect," he said, looking up at Lena with wonder in his expression. "She's ours," Lena corrected softly. As Maya grew, the mountain house filled with new life. Her laughter echoed through rooms that had once held only adult conversation. Her curiosity drove them outdoors more, exploring the wilderness that had once threatened them and now felt like home. They taught her to identify edible plants, to build fires safely, to respect and appreciate nature's power. But more than skills, they taught her through example. She saw her father cook dinner while her mother worked on a design project, saw them split childcare naturally, saw them disagree and work through conflict with respect and honesty. She grew up watching partnership in action, learning that strength could be gentle and vulnerability could be brave. One evening when Maya was 3, curled between them on the porch, as sunset painted the mountains, she asked the question they'd been anticipating. "Mama, how did you and Daddy meet?" Lena and Adrian exchanged glances over her head, communicating silently the way they'd learned to do over years together. How much to tell? How to explain something so complex to someone so young? "We met in the sky," Adrian said finally, "and fell to earth together." "Like angels?" Maya's eyes were wide with imagination. "Like people who needed to learn how to fly," Lena corrected gently. "And we taught each other." It wasn't the full story. That would come later, when Maya was old enough to understand danger and death and the miracle of survival. But it was truth enough for now. Truth that honored what they'd been through without burdening a child with its weight. Maya accepted this explanation the way children do, already moving on to the next question, the next curiosity. But as Lena watched her daughter chatter about birds and clouds and what it would feel like to fly, she felt Adrian's hand find hers, felt the squeeze that said he understood. They'd survived so much. The crash in the wilderness and the wolves and the bear. The return to civilization and the pressure to resume old lives. The breaking of toxic family ties and the building of healthy new ones. They'd survived doubt and fear and the terrifying vulnerability of loving someone completely. And from that survival, they'd built this. A life full of purpose and partnership and pure joy. A family created not from obligation, but from conscious choice. A legacy measured not in money or power, but in love freely given and gratefully received. Years continued to pass. Maya grew, eventually joined by a brother who had Lena's quick smile and both parents' stubborn determination. The mountain house expanded to accommodate their growing family, but its heart remained the same. The porch where Lena and Adrian still watched sunsets, the clearing where they'd made life-altering promises, the forest that held memories of their transformation. Adrian's relationship with his mother never fully healed, but it achieved a kind of détente, respectful distance punctuated by occasional visits where both parties tried, imperfectly, to find common ground. More importantly, Adrian broke the cycle, became the father he'd needed instead of the one he'd had. His children never doubted his love, never had to earn his approval, never felt like their worth was conditional. Lena's nonprofit grew beyond anything she'd imagined, eventually expanding to multiple cities and helping thousands of young people discover their creative potential. Adrian supported it not by taking control, but by believing in her vision and providing resources without strings. Together, they built something that would outlive them, a foundation for opportunity and hope. But their greatest legacy remained each other. On their 10th anniversary, they returned to the wilderness one more time, just the two of them, leaving the children with Sarah's family. They hiked to the crash site, finding it nearly reclaimed by forests now, nature healing the scars they'd left. "Do you remember what you were thinking?" Lena asked, standing where Adrian's seat had landed. "In that last moment before we hit? That I'd wasted my life." His voice was quiet with remembered pain. That I'd spent 34 years building something hollow and was going to die, never having really lived. And now? He turned to her, and in his eyes she saw the accumulation of 10 years of choosing each other, of building a life with intention and love. "Now I know what living actually means. It means waking up next to you. It means watching our children grow into good humans. It means building things that matter with someone who sees me, really sees me, and loves what she finds." Lena moved into his arms, fitting against him with the familiarity of a decade together. "I love you," she said simply. "Not despite what we went through, but because of how we went through it together." "I love you too." He kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for making it worth saving." They stood like that as the sun moved across the sky. Two people who'd fallen from it and learned to fly in the falling. Two people who'd survived the impossible and built something extraordinary from the survival. Two people who'd chosen each other over and over until the choosing became as natural as breathing. The forest whispered around them, holding memories of terror and triumph, of desperation and determination, of two strangers becoming partners, becoming lovers, becoming family. And in that whisper, Lena heard the truth they'd learned in 31 days of hell and 10 years of heaven. They hadn't just survived the wilderness. They'd survived becoming the people they were always meant to be. And in doing so, they'd found not just life, but purpose. Not just survival, but meaning. Not just each other, but themselves. The fall that should have killed them had instead given them everything. As they walked back through the forest hand in hand, Lena looked up through the canopy at the sky they'd once fallen from. It was vast and beautiful, and no longer held any terror. Just possibility. Just the endless blue that had witnessed their transformation and would witness whatever came next. "Ready to go home?" Adrian asked. Lena squeezed his hand, thinking of the mountain house waiting for them, of the children who'd run to meet them, of the life they'd built together from wreckage and wilderness, and the simple choice to keep choosing each other. "Always," she said, "as long as home means you." They left the wilderness behind, but carried it with them always. In the strength they'd discovered, in the love they'd built, and the certainty that no matter what challenges came next, they would face them the same way they'd faced everything since the moment their eyes met in a falling aircraft. Together. Honest, unafraid. And that was the truest survival of all.